All right. So as you probably know by now, I'm Stefan. I'm a reader of the Antiochian Archdiocese. I currently live in Colorado, which is where Father just drove from. I left there on Memorial Day weekend, so he does win the award for the longest, or the longest drive to get here. Because this morning I only came from Ludlow, Massachusetts, which I thought was pretty impressive. But you know, so I also know downstairs. Oh, there he is. I know Subdeacon John, or Brad, from seminary. He graduated right before I started, but he came back and would sing in the choir, especially because I had a weak voice, so he was very helpful to me. So he was an integral part of my, especially early seminary experience, because I was at St. Vladimir's for 5 years. So, but I only was required to sing in the choir for the first 2. Does everyone have the document on their phone? It came out a little weird on my phone, which is why I have my computer, and I'll draw important things on the board so that they make more sense in case it doesn't.
I'm not a phone with me, so I will just
that is more first century. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, it's always good to start off with what is a liturgical rite, because people use the word rite to mean a lot of different stuff. And to be honest, it is a very ambiguous term. It's not incorrect to use it in other ways, but for our purposes here, I am going to use the definition that was delineated by Bishop Daniel Fendikian, who is of the Armenian Church. It is an integrated system of worship, having its own rules and its own inner logic, representing the official expression of the totality of that church's Christian faith. And then after that, I included another quote from Father Michael Kaiser. He was a priest of the Antiochian Archdiocese. He served both in the Eastern and the Western rites of our Archdiocese, and he explained that the word rite means the forms, words, and actions that are used in worship. In other words, the way in which a worship service is put together and expressed. Father Michael actually died on my birthday in 2020, so God rest his soul. So those are, I think, really good ways to explain what a rite is in the way that we're speaking of it. So it's not simply just, oh, we did a different liturgy today, like when you do the liturgy of Saint Basil instead of Saint John Chrysostom. In one understanding, you can say, oh, we're doing the rite of Basil instead of the rite of Chrysostom, but in terms of how we are defining it here, that's within the same liturgical rite. And even if you go to like a Greek or a Serbian or an Antiochian church, and you see like the variation of the service, but it's more or less what you're accustomed to here, that's the same rite. What a different rite would be was, for example, I just mentioned that in the Antiochian Archdiocese, we have some parishes that serve the Western rite. We have a vicariate for that, and actually the church that I just came from this morning is a Western rite Antiochian church that I was assigned to last year. I was staying with them this past week to gather the last of my things. So I was with them yesterday for Sunday, and then got up really early today to come down here and be with all of you. All liturgical rites have a daily cycle of services that are appointed for certain times, marking the different hours of the day. So those are services like Vespers, Matins, or Compline, or first hour, third hour, etc. And then you, of course, have the Divine Liturgy. It's also called the Holy Sacrifice, the Offering, the Mass. These are all perfectly fine terms to speak of the Eucharistic service in any liturgical context. In English, we often will just say the word liturgy to mean the Divine Liturgy, and while that's not incorrect, I feel like that's incomplete because the other services are part of the liturgical cycle, so they are liturgy. They're just not the Divine Liturgy. Makes sense. there's the every liturgical rite, has a way that they do baptism, chrismation, confession, etc. So all of the sacraments that we know of and think of, that exists in all of those traditions. And of course, the Eucharist itself is of course a sacrament. There's chanting systems that exist. Obviously, we're probably all aware that there's a variety of different tonal systems in the liturgical tradition that we're accustomed to. And so each historic rite has at least one system. Most have multiple. And I find a lot of them also have 8 modes, which is very interesting. That's kind of like across the board what you find. Not all of them have necessarily been organized the same way. So a Coptic classmate of mine, when I said that, he's like, well, I wouldn't say that we have 8 modes. And then he explained it to me like something, and I was like, that kind of sounds like 8 modes to me, but all right, if that's not how you're comfortable explaining it, then I'm not gonna like force that on you, And then of course, there's vestments that we wear in the altar and such, so those will vary, across the various liturgical rites, and there's variety in that. I'm sure you've seen like high back versus low back vestments and things like that. So like those sorts of things exist in the other liturgical traditions. Even when you put a certain vestment on, what you call a certain vestment, because we'll borrow words sometimes. So in the Eastern or the Byzantine rite, what the priest wears around his neck is what? Yeah, so stole. We actually stole that word from the Western tradition. What a priest wears in the Western rite is actually a stole. In the Byzantine, it's properly the epitrachelion. But I mean, I don't have a problem with people saying stole. It's, because we live in the West, we speak English, it's easier to say stole, right? But in Greek, it's the epitrachelion. What is it in Russian? Or do they just use the Greek?
I don't know. It's funny how, at least in OCA culture, or maybe it's probably American culture of Orthodoxy, we'll use a Greek or a Russian word for things. And why we happen to like prefer the Russian or the Greek word for various items is I don't know what the rationale for that is, but
Sure.
Yeah, I've only ever heard it called an epiphany.
Okay, well then maybe that is just what, yeah. So.
I think in that case it varies with vestments, but I think in that case the Russian is just that.
Okay, yeah, because I know the diamond,
Yeah,
which,
that's different.
right, because that would be the epigonatian,
Yeah.
but otherwise it's the
I can't remember.
Politza, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
Then you have a nabedrenic, which isn't used in the Greek style.
That's just a Russian one, yeah.
Yeah, so, awesome. And then iconography, of course, that's an integral part of the experience of liturgical worship. But just like the chanting, there's not necessarily one school of iconography for each liturgical tradition. So you can walk into a parish and find some of them really like a particular iconographic program and such, but other times you might come across a variety of styles. There's people that are very opinionated about these things. And sometimes newer things take over older traditions. So what most people think of as Coptic iconography is actually new. It's more properly called Neo-Coptic. And a lot of the Coptic icons that people think are like Western influence are actually their older style. So if you look at like the Fayum portraits from the 2nd century, they look very Western and realistic, but it's actually like ancient Egypt. So.
There you go.
Yeah, well, it's because the Renaissance was influenced by a lot of that stuff. They were actually like reintroducing these ancient ideas and cultures into what they were doing. So that's why. That's the secret to the mystery. All liturgical traditions have a history of fasting. So the normative Wednesday, Friday fast, right? Wednesday because our Lord was betrayed on Wednesday. Friday because he was crucified. And then also the Eucharistic fast, which largely is no food consumption, and in various locales they'll make exception for like water or like medicine and things like that, but generally no consumption of food or drink in preparation to receive our Lord. And there's a lot of variety, though, even within a particular tradition. So, like in the Antiochian Archdiocese, we are required to go fast-free from Pascha to Ascension. We got angry letters about this while I was in seminary, because not everyone was doing this. We have to be fast-free through Ascension, whereas most other Eastern Orthodox traditions will return to fasting Wednesday and Friday after Bright Week, but it's not completely fasting, right? Because it's like some will still have fish. I've seen that on the Russian calendar. Others will still have like wine and oil. So even like little details like that will vary. And that's within a particular rite. So then you pull in the other traditions like the Coptic and the Ethiopian traditions. They're fast free all the way through Pentecost, but then start the Apostles' Fast the day after Pentecost. So that's kind of like a trade-off, And then I included the word typicon here. That is largely used within a Byzantine context, but it just means order. So if you hear the Latin word ordo, that's literally what that means, and it's often referring to how a specific variation of the rite is going to be put together, because a lot of these liturgical traditions have multiple ways of enacting them. And so like I mentioned before, if you attend a different parish of another jurisdiction that's doing the same basic liturgy that you do here, but you'll notice other things might not be the same, that's because they may be following a different typicon or order, but it's still the same overall rite. All right, now this is where, I don't know what it looks like on y'all's phone, but it came out on my phone where everything was just all one row down, and that's not how that's supposed to look. So I will fix that on the whiteboard. This marker is going to give me a hard time. Here
You need another marker?
we go. I might, yeah.
I'm sorry, that's probably my own children playing with the markers.
What does it look like on someone's phone? Can someone show me real quick? Oh, that looks perfect. That's exactly how that should look.
Yeah.
All right, what about yours?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think when I saved it as a PDF, I think that fixed
Oh,
it.
okay.
'Cause I think like Google Docs or the Word, or the Word program, I was coming up goofy on there for me too. And I put in PDF and it fixed it.
Okay, so let's go to everyone's phone. All right. There must be something weird on mine, which is fine, because I know what it's supposed to say. All right, well, that saves me a lot of writing. So when they teach us the history of liturgics and seminary and liturgical theology and all that really fun stuff that I live for, they will break up the historic rites into two families. So the families are often referred to as the Alexandrine or the Antiochian. Sometimes they're called Alexandrian and Antiochian, but I save those specific declinations for other contexts, because those words mean other things now in our modern day as well. So I keep the archaic English for when we are speaking about the liturgical families. And so the Alexandrine includes the Coptic and the Tewahedo, so that's like the Ethiopian tradition, and the Roman or Western or Latin. A lot of these rites have multiple names in academia and also in popular
So,
thought.
just a quick question.
Sure.
Under Roman, so would that include all the other extinct variants of the Western Rite, like the Sarum and the
It should, yeah.
Mozarabic and stuff? Those are all Alexandrians too?
Yeah, and I mean, they all follow a certain logic of like Western liturgical thought. Like, so even though they had some significant differences from the Roman office and the Mass and all that, I still think it's safe to kind of put them in the same
boat,
yeah. And especially, I mean, there are pockets of the Roman Catholic Church that still do the Mozarabic.
In Barcelona, somewhere in Spain.
Right.
The Cathedral in Barcelona still does the Mozarabic.
Yeah, because that sounds about where that would be most prominent. And also the Ambrosian use is still done in Milan and in Switzerland. And so those, now some people argue, well, those have, in recent centuries, conformed more to Latin practice and whatnot. But I'm like, yeah, that's what happens with liturgics. That literally happened in the Byzantine Rite too. So that's not that, so yes, I think it's fair to put all of those Western liturgies under the banner of, Western Rite or Roman Rite, and, same way that like in the Byzantine Rite, there's like, the Russian or the Greek way, but there's also like all these other like Slavic ways and stuff that are not quite like either. Yeah, that was actually a great question, because I figured somebody at some point would be like, what about SAR and what about this and that? So, and the reason why these are considered Alexandrine is simply because those areas historically the liturgy took a lot of shape in northern Africa. And even some of like the early Latin saints that we think of from like Carthage and Hippo, that's North Africa, but they're like speaking and writing in Latin. So, but then also Egypt is right there, and then Ethiopia, or as was referred to as the Aksumite kingdom, or Abyssinia, that was just a little further south. So they're all taking influence and shape from North Africa, and that's why it's called that. So here we're gonna break the dichotomies of like East-West thinking, because when it comes to like liturgics, it doesn't always work so smoothly like that. And then you have the Antiochian family, which includes the Byzantine Rite, which is the one that I assume we're all most familiar with here. And then the Armenian and the West Syrian and the East Syrian. And this is just because the primary forms of development that took place in these liturgical traditions occurred in areas that historically the Patriarch of Antioch was seen as the primate over. And I have a little note here: each rite is unique, and these family categorizations are convenient groupings, largely because of developmental territory. And as Bishop Daniel likes to say, the overall tradition is the same, but the specifics are completely different. I like that, because orthodoxy is paradoxy, so we should embrace that. All right, and then further down here, I just have a breakdown of not every, but most of the like communions of churches we're going to be speaking about, right? There's the Eastern Orthodox, which is where we are, and there's the Oriental Orthodox, and then the Roman Catholic Church also has all of these rites. And so I have a nice little thing here that just talks about like, it just lists all of the jurisdiction and based on rite. But for the Eastern Orthodox, I just make a note that, the majority do the Byzantine Rite. We have smaller pockets, like I just mentioned, that do what is properly called the Roman Rite, but we say the Western Rite. And then there was a brief period of time at the turn of the 20th century where the East Syrian Rite was done under the Russian Church, and that sadly died out due to genocides and communism, things like that. Those are usually not good things for people. So I also have a group on Facebook called Bring the East Syrian Rite Back to Orthodoxy, though. So some of us are hoping for it and working on it.
So who practices the East Syrian Rite today?
That's a great question, because I was about to go to the page. So perfect timing there, Father. Well, actually, so the majority of Christians that pray the East Syrian Rite are actually under the Roman Catholic Church. They're known as the Chaldean Church, and there's also the Syro-Malabar. Those are actually the two most prominent ones. And the East Syrian tradition is actually the third most common liturgical rite that is part of the Roman communion. The second being the Byzantine, and the first obviously being the Roman. But then you also have the Assyrian Church, the East, and the Ancient Church, the East, and those little smaller groups as well that celebrate
so
the rite.
Just so people have some historical context, give
Yes.
us a little tell us who the Church of the East is.
All right.
And how they're the same and different from the Chaldean rite, which is under Rome.
Yeah.
That might be helpful.
Yes. So I gave a talk in Kentucky on Pentecost, and I covered this. So I'm like ready. I'm like readier than normal to talk about that. So, all right. We all know our ecumenical councils here, right? Okay. What happened in 431?
Quick. Catechumen, 431.
No.
Okay.
That was not.
All right,
That was not
we're gonna have to push that back.
Ephesus.
Yeah.
The Council of Ephesus.
Okay.
Council of Ephesus. The Council of Ephesus affirms that Jesus Christ is like his humanity and his divinity are united, right? Because you had the patriarch Nestorius, who was teaching like a separation of that. He was saying Christ was two hypostases, which is not the same as two persons, but it's close enough that it bothered a lot of people. Okay, so, however, way out east, because remember, Nestorius was in Constantinople, okay, but way further east you had a church that was referred to as the Church of the East. Sometimes historically it gets the label of the Persian Church. I actually don't know that they ever called themselves that, but either way, that church had already kind of been asserting like its independence from the Patriarchate of Antioch. So about, let's see, 410, the Synod of Seleucia, I think it was, that's the first recorded evidence of an attempt at liturgical uniformity. And they were basically like, the standard that's done in Seleucia Ctesiphon. I had to practice saying that in seminary, which was like the seat of the Church of the East. That's like modern day Iraq. I don't know offhand which city that is now, but they said like they set the standard for what the rest of us do, and so that is the first recorded evidence of something like that. And so you already see like they are starting to like come into their own and do their own thing, and then when this happens, they're like, wait, that's the Christology that we've always taught. And so that obviously ultimately led to them separating from us.
And they were mostly outside the Roman Empire, right?
They were in the Persian Empire.
Yeah.
And there were, for centuries, there were people, or rather like dioceses, and sometimes their own patriarchs. So when they were part of the church, they were actually what was called a Catholicate, which is like, if you have like a patriarchate, a Catholicate's like under that, but it's still part of the patriarchate. We don't have this anymore in the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Oriental Orthodox do, but we don't really have that system anymore. Although the Patriarch of Georgia, the word Catholicos is still in his name, because Georgia was once a Catholicate of Antioch, as was Seleucia Ctesiphon, as was many other places. Armenia, the Armenian church is actually, Catholicos is their highest rank, but the Catholicate of Armenia was also once under the Patriarchate of Antioch. So Antioch was central to a lot of these greater areas. And so you have their liturgical uniformity attempt, and then you have the Christology issues. So they were already sort of like weaning themselves to like being their own thing. And also at some point in here, they declared their Catholicos was now a patriarch. And I'm pretty sure Antioch never approved that. So, that's so it wasn't just the council thing, but it's like that mixed in with a lot of other things led to a split. But there were other patriarchs and bishops who would like unite to, the Byzantine church for a time, but then they would leave again, and then there were dioceses that were split. There's a joke that even the Nestorian patriarch is two persons, things like that. So,
That's funny.
yeah. And there's Saint Isaac the Syrian is an East Syrian saint who was actually part of a diocese in what we now call Qatar that had just united to the church that we would call Nestorian. And then he kind of like didn't want to fight with people, so he ran off to join a monastery. And his writings were only preserved though, like at that monastery and also at Saint Savas Monastery in Jerusalem, which is a Byzantine monastery that like set the standard for a lot of later Byzantine liturgics. So it just shows you how like confusing things were. Yes.
When these splits occurred outside of the context of councils, formal councils,
Yeah.
were they charging each other with heresy?
Yes.
Like people anathematized? And, okay.
Yeah.
Par for the course.
Oh yeah, that's like standard procedure. Yeah. So
Where are
Then-
most of the East Syrians today? Like, I mean,
America, actually.
yeah, that's what I thought,
Yeah.
right? Because of the Iraq War, right?
Yeah, and a lot of other things too. Yeah.
Because their biggest concentration was what, northern Iraq, right?
Yeah, at one point. Yeah, and now so the two the patriarchs of the Assyrian Church of the East and the ancient Church of the East both live in America, and yeah, in fact, the one for the ancient Church of the East, he's like from Chicago, so he is American.
That's like.
I mean, isn't that hilarious though?
Yeah. Oh,
The ancient
and the other guy's from California.
Chicago.
wacky, very wacky.
Yeah, and the guy from the Assyrian Church is from California. Yeah, it's funny, but it's also sad because like the reason, you know what I mean, is because they're getting slaughtered, you know, because even, I mean, you know, despite the disagreements and stuff like that, I'm not, you know, it's like we want to see these ancient, you know, traditions thrive and like hopefully reunite with them. Which, I mean, sometimes persecution does that, and then forcing you into a small corner with someone else and actually talking things through. So, however, one thing that I think is important to note with all that is, I thought that was not going to erase, which wouldn't be the worst thing. So in the 16th century, I don't remember the year offhand, but the Nestorian Church, right, the Church of the East, had been doing this thing called uncle to nephew succession. Each nephew would become the next patriarch. And obviously, you know, that was a little sus to a lot of people. So some got sick of it, and Rome had already been trying to make inroads with them. So this is already after the Council of Leon, the Council of Florence, which were not only attempts at Rome to reconcile with the Eastern Orthodox, but, you know, attempts to reconcile with the Oriental Orthodox and the Nestorians as well. And so that led to basically an abbot of a monastery uniting to Rome, and then they made him the patriarch of what they referred to as the Chaldean Church. Okay, but then a few Chaldean patriarchs in, you know what they started doing? Uncle to nephew succession. And so Rome like refused to recognize like 3 in a row. They're just like, this is the literal thing you know were griping about if you enter union with us, and now you're doing it. So they took another guy from another diocese and were like, you're now the Chaldean patriarch that we recognize. So eventually, and I think it was 16. Okay, now it's a different color.
Just keep trying.
Yeah. 16. All right, that's a lot better. 1692. I think it's that. Yeah. That line, which is some texts refer to it as the Shimonite line, which means Simon, because every patriarch in the Chaldean church, with the exception of one, had the name Simon or Shimon, right? That's how they would say it in East Syriac. So it gets referred to as the Shimonite line. So they separated from Rome in 1692. Okay, so then you have the Chaldean line still going, you have the Shimonite line that's now independent, and you have the other historic Nestorian church that is still on their own. So you have 2 Nestorian churches again, and that's where the joke comes in. Oh yeah, you know, even the patriarch's 2 people, right? Even though it's technically apostases, but that joke is just not as funny, right? Because it's too long of a word. So then, in I think 1804. Oh wait, I didn't draw the lines out. I'm sorry. So you have the Chaldean line. That's just pretty straight. That's still a thing. Wait, no, that's the bad one. Hold on. I got this.
There we go.
Yeah. So this is Chaldean. I'll have to break that word up. Chaldean. All right. And then you have this, 1692. For now, we'll call it Shemanite. But I got a surprise for you at the end. And then this guy over here, let's say Nestorian, historically was that. Okay, so, right. Now 1804 looks like it's misplaced, but you know that year. Okay, 1984, this line converges with this line. They get a guy who was the nephew to the patriarch, agreed to be the next patriarch, and then they fuse these lines. So what we're left with today is the Chaldean line of the Roman Catholic Church is actually the older line of succession to the Church of the East, basically, because this predated this break off, but then they got the historic line, they fused it. So,
Really? And so
they got them sandwiched.
And so the Shumanite line, is that, if you see a church that's like Assyrian Church of the East?
That's the Shumanite.
That's
Yep.
the Shumanite.
That was the surprise at the end. They only started calling themselves Assyrian Church of the East in like the 20th century. So other than that, they actually, I think for a time, were just calling themselves the Chaldean Church because that was the word that was used, under Rome as well. And then there was a newer schism over the calendar in the 1960s. That's where you get the ancient Church of the East, and because the Assyrian Church or the Shemanite line, they adopted the Gregorian calendar, and so the ancient Church of the East stayed on the Julian calendar. But then in 2011, you have another split because the ancient Church of the East was like, let's move Christmas, like just Christmas. So everything else is still on the old calendar except the Nativity of our Lord Jesus Christ. So they have commemorations in the East Syriac tradition, like the Friday after the Nativity, right? They're still reckoning that according to the old calendar. It's just only the Nativity is moved to the new calendar, which is like very weird and confusing, and rightfully upset this other line here, which, what are they even called officially? Most places just call them Old Calendar Church of the East because they kept the calendar intact, but I think officially they just title themselves Church of the East or Holy Apostolic Catholic Church of the East or something like that, right? And then you have one of my favorites, a guy named Mary Magdalen, who's in Australia. Yeah, you knew it was coming. I've been following him for years before he became a TikTok star.
Okay, this is so helpful. I've been trying to figure out how this guy's actually connected canonically.
Oh, okay, great. So he was a vicar bishop for the ancient Church of the East. And in 2013, he got in trouble for using icons. Oh yeah, because at some point here, the Shemanites / Assyrians, they stopped using iconography in their churches. And so he was like, this is part of our tradition. We need to bring it back. And they were like, no. So there were a few other things too. Like he was taking care of his mom or something, and they accused him of living with a woman, and he's like, that's my mom. She's sick, I'm taking care of her. So other things like that. He's got a whole video on YouTube assessing all the things that he's been accused of, so you can go watch that. It's kind of outside the purview here. Yes?
So all of these groups, barring the ones that united with Rome,
Right.
Are all still Nestorian?
I would even say the ones in union with Rome,
Okay.
because they still do the anaphora of Mar Nestorius. Mar means saint in East Syriac.
Oh, Saint
So
Nestorius.
unlike the Oriental Orthodox, which I will die on a hill to say it was a misunderstanding and they are Orthodox, this I think is actually a serious issue, especially if it led to them becoming iconoclasts.
Yes.
I mean, God forgive me,
Yeah,
I'm not
you could make you can see how you could make a through line there that if there's enough of a separation of the incarnation that it could possibly compromise how you conceive of
Exactly.
iconography. So
Yes, and I do want to be clear. They do not, nor have they ever taught that Christ is two persons. But the early saint, like Saint John of Damascus, actually addresses this. He says the Nestorians venerate Christ as two hypostases and one person. I will now show you how this is still wrong, and they split him. So, that was not a misunderstanding. He very clearly understood the terms and addressed them on their terms. Whereas, with the Oriental Orthodox, there were other words that were being used more ambiguously that everyone was like, no, it means this, no, it means that. So, that is the way that it is. So Mary Magdalen broke off separately and was kind of with the old calendar Church of the East a little bit, but he still does the thing where he moves Christmas. I guess they didn't like that, so he's kind of on his own now. But he uses icons, like externally, his services are pretty much how I would want an Orthodox East Syrian or Assyrian church to be like. Except for like the sections where he allows like an acoustic guitar for a little bit, we can take that out. But but like outside of that, I'm like, this is pretty much part and parcel like what I would want. So just let's pray for that. And
yeah, if people don't know, Mary Magdalen was this like YouTube bishop, religious figure on YouTube. Has a pretty big following, and I've listened to his stuff and some of his sermons. And I'm like, pretty good stuff, right? But also, whenever you see a personality like that, and you're always just like, it's not clear who they're a part of. You're always a little suspicious of people like that when it's not clear.
Right.
How many parishes, like how many actual adherents do these bishops have?
I mean, I would have to check the internet to give you exact numbers. But I can tell you that the Chaldean church that's under Rome is like at least twice the size of the Assyrian church. I can tell you that much. But what number? I think it is in the millions. I want to say it is, but then if it's not, you'll think I lied to you. So I'm just not going to commit.
But these like YouTube bishops, like
that guy.
How big are
Him.
their?
So yeah, him I'm not sure because he has his one church in Australia.
So one parish.
As far as I know, he had churches, like, he came to America, there were some Chaldean Roman Catholic priests that got in trouble, so he's like, hi, I was in trouble too, I'll help you. And he came and like served with them. I shared this video on my Facebook group, like, I seriously, like, stalking this guy. And then, I don't know whatever came of that. There used to be a website, what was it, True Light of the East, I think it was, where you could follow, like, the churches under him, like, even outside of Australia, but they don't have that map anymore, so I don't know if they, like, I'm not sure what happened there. But his, like, official membership following is probably very low. But there's a lot of people that follow him on YouTube and they smash that like button and subscribe and all that stuff. And he even said in a talk that I saw, he said, we have Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox and Roman Catholics here. So I was like, okay, he's getting a lot of people that are not in union with him, but that are still attending his talks or maybe his services.
But then how does he think of himself in terms of apostolic succession and like the overall, like
ask
how
him on
does he
YouTube.
fit? Okay.
Well, no, like, and also, I didn't mean that as like a dismissive thing. It's just, I don't actually know. I would guess he has this idea. I hesitate to use the word ecumenism because that word just means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But he has like a branch theory idea because on his website he says he'll commune Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Roman Catholics. Interestingly enough, he doesn't say he'll commune with Assyrians, but maybe that's a given. But like, so he probably has this idea of like, if you have apostolic succession that is like traceable, then you're good by me. That's my guess.
Sounds very Anglican.
Yeah.
I don't know if this info is correct, but after he was stabbed recently,
Yeah.
wasn't there like a Syrian, like, group of bishops who released a statement saying that they were praying for him? He was like a self-appointed bishop and had no, like.
That's happened a few times.
Okay.
So in his defense, he's never pretended to be part of the Assyrian church or the ancient church. Like I said, he has a video of himself going through all of his accusations and talking about why he went out on his own. So he's never, as far as I know, he's never pretended to be something he's not. But I think a lot of people will log into YouTube and see him, and they'll see he's wearing like a Coptic style cap. So some people thought it was Coptic, and that was like a gift he got from a Coptic monk. And they issued a letter too, saying he has a cap from us as a gift. It would be great if he would clarify his Christological stance. It said something like that. So there's been a lot of confusion over him, and I'm not sure if he's aware of it or if he likes it. Like I can't speak to that. But as far as I've seen, he has never pretended to be something he's not. He's always admitted that he's on his own, but he sees himself as like spiritually united to all these other apostolic groups. I mean, he's got a picture of the Coptic Pope Kyrillos VI on his altar. and he talked about how he venerates him and stuff like that. So,
But he
You
is
know.
a bishop? Or no?
Mari Emanuel,
Yeah.
yeah, in this
And
context,
who
yeah.
ordained him?
He was ordained by the ancient Church of the East. I don't know the name of the bishop that is there in Australia, but the guy that was there, because he was his auxiliary. And that's another thing. The Assyrian bishop of Australia and New Zealand, he made a video where he was addressing the Mari Emanuel thing, and he's like, he's never been part of our church, and he was just an auxiliary for the ancient church, like really just trying to put him down. And yeah, so again, he's never pretended to be anything he's not, as far as I
Yeah,
know.
what's funny about him, this is an example, like I had my in-laws who are Baptists say,
Uh-oh.
have you heard of this guy, Mari Emanuel? Because several friends or people we know who are also Baptists have been listening to him and really like his stuff.
Yo,
So they
that's
were
crazy.
like, what's up with him? And I was like, I don't really know. And then I started watching some of his stuff, and I was like, well, you know, like, for someone who's just going there for like spiritual edification, his stuff's decent, you know?
Right.
You know, I never saw him do something that was like, whoa, 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 you know, or anything like that. But it's confusing because you're trying to explain like who this person is to people, and they're just like, it's weird
Right.
and ambiguous.
Well, and
you know?
he publicly said in another talk that he is fine with the term Theotokos, and I probably should have mentioned this before. The Church of the East and Nestorius himself didn't like that term. They didn't like the fact that God could have a mother. So he's okay with that. So I mean, he might just be trying to play like multiple sides. But if that's true, then hopefully that might lead to him, you know, uniting to us at some point. But I also will say there's a danger, and he's so famous now that he might just think he's totally cool on his own.
Yeah.
And that can also be, you know, a problem, because he might want to be received like as a bishop, and most of our jurisdictions probably wouldn't do that because he's like a few steps removed from like a direct line. You know what I mean? So I'm not sure how that would be.
So like the bishop who ordained him is already not
Correct.
kosher.
Yeah,
And
and
what
he
about
was
the
already
bishop
removed
who
from another
ordained
group,
that?
from another group that's under Rome now that had, you know,
Yeah.
circle sandwich.
And so the group that has the most sort of like apostolic or historical legitimacy is the one that's completely united to Rome
Yes.
as an Eastern Rite.
Right, and
Yeah.
also as Orthodox, we do acknowledge that Rome has apostolic succession. You know, like that's not really what's in question when it comes to us in Rome. Like that's not so. Yeah, so if they're under Rome anyway, even if we don't like that they're under Rome, right, instead of with us, you know, that still gives them more of a direct succession line. It just helps that when Rome did that, they kind of attacked them from both sides and got the. I mean, it's very impressive if you're into that sort of thing. So.
I mean, I wonder, you know, this drive to try to unify people and not allow things to be divisive that may seem picayune to some people who don't really know the theory behind it all.
Yeah.
Is that not perhaps bordering on syncretism though? Because you got people who really have fundamentally very different
Absolutely.
traditions,
Mhm.
and you're just making a stew.
Sure.
And is that better in terms of unifying people under those premises?
Yeah.
Or is it dangerous?
So your question actually leads me back to what the original topic is, which is liturgical rites. And so thank you for that, because hopefully this will answer your inquiry and also get us a little back on track. Not that that was not like really exciting, it was. So yeah, for example, right, I mentioned that in the Antiochian Archdiocese we have a vicariate for the Western Rite, okay, and I serve within that capacity. In fact, out in Colorado, we have a Western Rite monastery. I lived there for a year after seminary. I still go there and visit and I serve, and the plan, God willing, when I'm back in Colorado next month is I'll be with them every weekend. So that's a case where, you know, we saw that union with Rome or reunion with Rome really wasn't going to happen. And there were Anglicans for centuries who would dialogue with the Orthodox. And some of the stuff that the Anglicans said was like very impressive, but it still just never really came to anything. So here in America, you had St. Tikhon and St. Raphael who rubbed shoulders with the Episcopalians, and even Metropolitan Platon, right, who was over what was known as the Metropolia, now the OCA. He flat out said, of course, if the Episcopalian Church joins Orthodoxy, they will be Western. Like, it was like not even a question that they would have to that they would be allowed to keep, their rite. They wouldn't have to become Eastern. And so because, the hope was we would get these whole dioceses and whole bodies in, that's not what occurred. They came in smaller waves. And so the Antiochian Archdiocese, our Western Rite Vicariate was founded in 1958 with only like a handful of parishes that came in, and it's grown since. ROCOR also has a Western Rite that's kind of like come and gone in waves, because the Russian church here had a Western Rite thing, and then they all moved to ROCOR when that whole split occurred. But for a while, it was just monasteries under ROCOR. A lot of the parishes that ROCOR has now, that saw a spike in like 2010. So,
And the Western Rite monasteries, they're historically Anglican? Like, what is the source of that?
Oh, it's a good question. So, the monastery in Colorado, the abbot of our monastery there, he was actually a Franciscan. So he was Roman Catholic, and then he converted to Orthodoxy many decades ago. And that monastery follows the rule of Saint Benedict, because regardless of when we draw the line at when the Great Schism took place, a lot of things, like a lot of significant shifts and changes occurred in the 11th century. You really can't get around. And one of those is the development of orders. Before that, it was just you're a Christian monastic in the West. You inherently follow the rule of Benedict, because he traveled to some monasteries and he collected like the best of all that and said like, this is the ideal rule. And then he became the standard. So a Western Rite Orthodox monastery should follow the rule of Saint Benedict, and we do there. The only other rule that I think could be acceptable would be the rule of St. Augustine, because it goes back to his time. But the Augustinian order of the Roman Church is much later. I want to say 17th century. So even though the rule is ancient, the order that follows it is actually like way, way later. And the Antiochian Western Rite Vicariate sort of has a blend. It has like Anglican and Latin stuff. And honestly, like, synthesis is a natural part of liturgy. Even in what we call the Byzantine Rite, you have a combination of like the cathedral services and then the monastic services, and then they get combined. And then, I served at a ROCOR mission for 1.5 years that mostly followed like Antiochian style rubrics. But we would also pull in like Russian stuff too. So there's like this like, even within one rite, when there's like variations, there's just a natural tendency to like borrow from other traditions as well. And like you see that in the OCA, right? The OCA Diocese of New England in particular, I've seen is very diversified, because you have people from like Ukrainian, Carpatho-Russian, and even like Serbian backgrounds and stuff. And they'll incorporate those things. So specifically within the Western Rite Vicariate, it's mostly Anglican and Latin stuff that is.
And John of Shanghai, San Francisco was a big promoter
Yes,
of the Western Rite
yes.
during his lifetime, right?
Yeah, and there's photos. If you Google John Maximovich, John of San Francisco Western Rite, you'll see him, like, and Photoshop was not a thing then, so it's real. Like he is actually ordaining a bishop for ROCOR that oversaw Western Rite churches there in Europe. And he did, in particular, like a reconstructed usage. Like you were asking me before, this one was called the Gallican use, or Gallican Rite. And that is an old like French usage. And so the people that he brought in were already doing that liturgy and were already doing the archaeology for it. So he just brought them in and he blessed them to continue their work. Although in all, I think when it comes to the Western Rite, the Latin and the Anglican usages are the ones that are the most firm, because even though it was outside the church, they were like continuous. They were still going. These other...
They weren't like broken off,
Exactly.
stopped, dead, restarted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm not against it. So for example, we've probably been to or are aware of parishes that'll do like the Liturgy of St. James every now and then, right? But you can't replace your Sunday service every Sunday with the Liturgy of St. James, because it's no longer like the heartbeat of our liturgical tradition, right? So like doing St. John Chrysostom most of the year and Basil 10 times a year, that wasn't the rhythm of the Byzantine Rite like from the start. right? That's like a later thing, but that's how it is now. So you can't just like inject an older liturgy and be like, this is what our parish is going to do now every Sunday, because it's just like it's not going to work. So I'd be okay, for whatever my opinion's worth, if a Western Rite church like did either the Latin or the Anglican usages as a regular thing, but then on certain feast days, like let's do the Gallican, let's do the Ambrosian, let's do the Mozarabic, but just on like those days, because they died out and were brought back and stuff, so they can't really be the natural rhythm of a church again. Unless maybe some of those Mozarabic and Ambrosian churches that are under Rome actually came into union with us, then maybe the story might be different. But, so does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
all of the historic rites that we've spoken of have liturgies that were done that are no longer done anymore. They've all had stuff fall out of use, and they all bring stuff back into use. It kind of comes in waves. So one thing I'd like to illustrate is, so there's this theory that I don't ascribe to. I used to kind of just say it when I gave lectures when I was playing safe by the book when I was in seminary, but now that I'm out in the wild, I'll say what I like. So there's like this theory that in Jerusalem you had what scholars like to call the, am I spelled right?
We won't judge your spelling.
Right? It's like I'm so confident that I'm like, wait, Hagiapolite, that means holy city, right? The liturgy of the holy city. And all the Christian rites descended from this off into their territory. People ran off, or the apostles did what they did, and it's like, yeah, then it all just like came from there, right? It was like an evolution of sorts. Now there's the reverse theory. Then there's the theory that actually what it was everyone was kind of doing what they wanted everywhere. You just did your own thing. But then you'd look over and be like, oh, I like that. And then eventually locales were like, we need to unify our, worship. So then it ascended into unity. That made more sense in my head, but just, right? So there's the one theory is like it went from uniformity to diversity. Then there's the reverse theory. It was diversity that went into unity. So, you know what my opinion is? Both. Or neither. I don't know, it depends how. So, we know that liturgical worship is just like a thing, right? So pagans and Jews of the early days, like they did liturgical worship, right? So it was just like assumed if you were worshiping, it was like, like to us now, because we have all these other groups that don't do liturgical worship, it has to be like explained to people. But in the, like historically, it was just assumed, like that's just what you did. You worship your deity. You offered it incense. You did.
We had altars. You chanted.
Yeah.
We wore robes.
I was about to say dance. I'm like, no, I don't like that. Yeah, but yeah. Well, actually, in some cases there were dancing. So this was all just assumed, right? This was not a thing you even had to explain to most people. So a theory that I like that I can't really. I mean, if I were to dig through some books, I could show you maybe some sources, but instead you'll just have to trust me. Because I'm wearing a black robe in front of you. So, I think it's safe to say that in Jerusalem itself, in the holy city, let's say that, holy city, Jerusalem, you already have multiple people there of all kinds of different, what we would now call ethnicities and things like that. I mean, Christians were unique because they were referred to as little Christs, right? That's where we get the word Christian. They didn't identify themselves by their country of origin and things like that, which is kind of ironic now when you see like Greek Orthodox Church, Serbian Orthodox Church, because the way Christians stood out was that they didn't label themselves that way. And so the reason is because they were all already here. So, and because this is where Christianity started and where it was like contained for, a good little bit. I don't think it's unreasonable to say at least the seeds of all of these rites that I have in my right up there already existed. They already were like different from each other, but they didn't like look the exact same way right now. So it's not like in the holy city at the time you're like, this is the Byzantine rite, and we're going to send this over to Greece, and it's going to turn into, right? Like That's not what I'm saying, but like what eventually led to these 7 distinct liturgical traditions already had a distinctness because these people were already living in the holy city, and then they traveled back home and were like, look what I learned. Also, this guy named Jesus too, you know, or rather that would actually be first. Sorry, the whole Jesus thing, and then they would adapt their worship to, you know, how the Christians are. So
it was diverse from the get-go.
yeah, yes,
You even see stuff like, say, we have written anaphras, right? But you see, if you go read Justin Martyr's text, the Trifum, I think, he has his anaphora in there, which is like, this is what I usually pray. But it was clear the way he talks that the anaphora was an extemporaneous prayer that the SaddleBrook would say.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like coded, right, the way we have it now. It was like free form and over time, right? Like, you know, certain thematic themes sort of like, you know, coalesce until we have, you know, something like a masterpiece like St. Basil's, right? But you can tell it very early on, so that's like 2nd, 3rd century, like
exactly.
people are just being extemporaneously making up the prayer like in the liturgy when it's being celebrated.
Yeah. And then we see that even in each of the distinct liturgical rites or the distinct liturgical traditions, we see a wave of like uniformity and then diversity and then like uniformity again, like even just within that one. So, yeah.
Do scholars know like what the Western Rite looks like in like the 10th or 11th century? And like how similar is that to like the Western Rite that's celebrated in like the Antiochian church?
It's not that different from what we do in the Antiochian Vicariate. So everyone's favorite boogeyman, Charlemagne, he essentially mandated liturgical uniformity in the West. And again, that's not, regardless of anything else you want to say about him, that's not that weird, right? Like the Church of the East had already done that like 3 centuries before. And then later in the Byzantine world, we had Theodore Balsamon, right, in like the 13th century, who made all the Byzantine churches conform to the practice of Constantinople. Literally said, we know of no liturgy of St. James or St. Mark. Like, cease with these immediately. Which is like crazy, because like was not true. But he just didn't want anyone doing anything not done in Constantinople. So every liturgical rite has gone through a wave of like, or multiple waves of, you know, simplifying and unifying, and then it goes back to diversity. So, but to answer your specific thing about the Western Rite, from the time of Charlemagne onward, you know, any attempt at variety was kind of stamped out. So the Council of Trent, you know, which was like 16th century, that didn't really change anything. It just said this particular usage of the Roman Rite that's been the practice from pretty early on, but certainly from the time of Charlemagne on, that's still the standard. And they said, you know, the Mozarabic and the Ambrosian and all these other like micro usages, that those are fine too, but like this is the standard. So Trent didn't really change anything about the actual mass or the services that I'm aware of. We actually made changes in the Antiochian Vicariate, like little things, just to make sure it conformed with Orthodox theology. Like I always like to say, we don't say the F word in church, right? Because the whole filioque controversy was really what like a bulk of what that schism was over. So we didn't really schism over, oh, you do a different liturgy. Like that's not what really any of these schisms were about. There were other schisms like that, like in Russia, right? You know, that schism was very much about it. You just changed everything, and we don't like it. But these earlier schisms, even though it's convenient because it's like, oh, well, they do a different liturgy, like obviously they are not the same as us. It's like that's only because how it, like, over time, you know, how people got situated. Yeah.
So how do some of the, there's like some theological differences in what's happening at certain points during the liturgy between East and West. Like, for example, like when do the gifts become the body and blood of Christ, right? Like in the East we say it's epithesis, right? How does that work in these Western rites?
It's a mystery. Next question. No, so yeah, so that is one of the changes that we had to do in what we call the Divine Liturgy of Saint Gregory, which essentially is the traditional Latin Mass, but for Orthodox use. We had to add an epiclesis, which there's there are mixed feelings about that. I've come to realize it does throw the rhythm of the anaphora off because they insert it right before what you could argue is already an epiclesis in the service itself. On the other hand, we obey what the bishops tell us to, so I try not to think too much about that. Because even if I don't want it there, guess what? That really doesn't matter. So, and I'm actually, like, at the end of the day, I'm fine with it. There's much bigger stuff I'd rather fight about. But, yeah, because I think a lot of Western scholars have said the change occurs at the words of institution. And there are saints of the church, east and west, and north and south, and wherever else, who speak that way too. It's not like the Orthodox have always taught, it's the epiclesis.
Is there one of the liturgical rites that doesn't have words of institution?
Yeah, I was just thinking of that.
Yeah.
The East Syriac rite does not, well, in their primary liturgy, in Saints Mary and Adai, which is the oldest one, there are no words of institution in that text. The other two anaphoras they have, which are named for heretics, Theodore Mopsuestia and Nestorius of Constantinople, ironically, those have the words of institution. So I've heard people theorize we could just pluck the ones from those into Mari and Adai and it'll be fine. Rome ruled a couple decades ago that the Chaldeans didn't have to have the words of institution when they prayed the liturgy of Adai and Mari. So, and I've wondered about this too, like what we would do with that. I'm sure the Russians at the time made them do it. Like that would just be my guess offhand, especially because the Russians were also people that were championing to add the epiclesis into the Roman rite. So why would they not also add the words of institution? And the earliest English translations of the Assyrian liturgy were done by Anglicans, and they just took it right out of the Bible. They even cite the Bible verse and everything. They're like, because these are missing in the manuscripts, like, okay. You know what I mean? Because it's like they haven't been in the text for so long. But they're just like, oh, these are missing. We're just going to fix this. So,
Is it served in English or Latin?
yes.
Oh,
Yeah, so most Western Rite churches serve in English as like a norm and a default, but sometimes you'll hear a little bit of Latin, and there are some parishes that'll offer, like, on a particular day of the week, they'll do the whole thing in Latin. At the monastery, often the abbot will do the anaphora, or what's properly within the Roman Rite called the canon of the Mass. He'll do that in Latin, but everything else will be English. And actually, there's a portion of the Western Mass that's usually in Greek, right? It's called the Kyrie. I have it in like the breakdown of each liturgy on the thing. It's called the Kyrie, and so that's usually done in Greek because that's a Greek word. But I've heard that done in English too. I've never heard that done in Latin though. So,
Stefan, let's do this. It's like almost 1:40.
Yeah.
Why don't you field maybe like 2 more questions?
yeah.
And then we can call it good. I mean, it's nice. People are, it's such a huge topic. It's
No, I
not
know.
anything but dip your toe in it, really.
Oh yeah, well
You
that's
know?
why you had me come and speak 4 times at your parish before, because there's just so much to unpack. I've got liturgical books with me just by pure coincidence that I don't know if anyone wants to take a look at, maybe like after or now. I'd forgotten about them because I went on a tangent, but
Yeah, just put them on the table when you're done.
Okay.
Go over and just like flip through.
now you can't take these home, they're mine. But sadly, I don't have an Ethiopian liturgy text with me because those are harder to come by. I had a copy in seminary, but it belonged to the Armenian seminary's library, so I had to give it back to them eventually. But I've got a whole bunch of Western Rite text, and pretty much every other liturgical rite is represented here in some way.
So, one of the things I think is, this might be kind of an interesting point is, you can go like on YouTube and if you search in like old Roman chant, right? And it's like really old like chant manuscripts from Rome. If you listen to them, you're like, wait a second, that sounds kind of Byzantine, right? And so one of the things I think is interesting is that like the further back you go in time, like East-West liturgics are more and more similar in certain ways. There's certain things that you can
Sure.
see that like there's identifiable like similarities, especially in parts of Italy that
Yeah.
are under Byzantium and stuff.
I would say that all traditional chant forms, so the Byzantine chant and even like Gregorian chant as it is now, but also the Coptic chant, West Syriac, East Syriac chant, Armenian chant, and the Ethiopian Ge'ez chanting. A lot of that does have like a ton in common because they're all like probably taken from old like Jewish melodies, but then also adding things in from their own tradition. Like there are Coptic people who straight up told me that some of their melodies were about like the pharaohs, and they just changed it to being about Christ.
Yeah, so I've read this in several places
Yeah.
that the basis of most of the Coptic chant system was actually from the Pharaonic temples
Mm-hmm.
and like their musical system.
Exactly.
But,
Which would be just right.
but Egypt and the ancient Jews interacted a lot too.
Of course,
So that
How
it's
different would
actually-
those have been? Actually,
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right on the money. Yeah, exactly. So, and what's really fascinating to me is when you listen to some of this old Baptist stuff, like in Appalachia and like other places, some of it sounds like a lot of this old chanting too. It's like, I think I learned this from, I think it was Father Andrew Stephen Damick. He posted something and I listened to it. I'm like, no way. Like this sounds really, like if I didn't know that this was Baptist, I'd be like, oh, what Ethiopian hymn is this? You know what I mean? It's crazy how, So, so this is actually Father Matthew's way of telling you from here on out, you're going to do Byzantine chant for all the services. Nothing new, everything. Or Znameni, because there's not many people that know how to do that anymore.
Not many.
There's not many. That's the old Russian chant that people don't know. Yeah. There's not many people left who know how to do it. Yeah.
That's painfully So here's a question. So we have the two main families,
Yes.
the Antiochian and the Alexandrian. What's the major differences between those? Like, are there certain big picture like distinctions?
I've been thinking about this because I think if I were to really analyze them, I could find them. One thing that I actually just was realizing recently is so, the Eucharist has to be prepared, right? We have the proskomedi in the Eastern or the Byzantine Rite. So at least within the Western Rite and the Coptic and the Ethiopian rites, which are all the Alexandrine family, that's all done within the context of the Mass itself. There's not like a separate like preparatory service. Like in the service, it's called the offertory, and they start preparing it, and then they consume it inside the context of the Divine Liturgy as well. So that's something all three of those have in common. And I'm pretty sure all of the Antiochian ones have what we have in the Byzantine Rite, where there's like a distinct office for preparing it and then consuming it that can be done while you're doing another service from the office, like the hours or matins or something. But it's not directly within the Divine Liturgy itself. But that's a theory I'm working on because I don't know for sure that second part is true about all those families. But I was like, I texted an Armenian friend of mine recently, and I'm like, do you have a separate service of like the preparing of the gifts, or is it within the context of the service? And it was a little bit of both. He's like, yeah, there's certain things we do before the actual liturgy starts, but there's other things that are done inside of it. So, yeah, so that's my kind of takeaway for that, only because that's been on my mind lately. But I'm definitely sure that there are other things, even like little like points of piety that I might not be able to like think of right now. But if you were just watch people at these services, because I had a friend of mine who's now a deacon at one of our Western Rite churches in Texas. I took him to a Coptic service, and it was an evening raising of incense, right? So it wasn't a divine liturgy, but it was like an evening prayer service. And he actually turned to me after and listed all these things he noticed in common with the Western Rite, and it's stuff that I didn't even catch at first, but he's like more like at the time he was more immersed in the Western tradition than I was, so he caught on to more stuff. So there's, yeah, I think that there are things, I just don't.
Well, all right, well, Simon, thank you. We'll get around on that, that was helpful. So if you have any more, if you ever have any liturgical questions about comparative rites, just get a hold of that guy.
Yeah, just remember, all rights matter. I have like 80 memes on Facebook that say that.
Thanks, Simon. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Father.